Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this inaugural lecture of the Center for European Research. I'm Dr. Sarah Wolf. I'm from the School of Politics and International Relations. And it's an immense honor to welcome you tonight, but also our keynote speaker, Jonathan Faull, who will discuss the state of the negotiations of Brexit. It provides us with his insightful analysis of the situation. After his speech, we will also have reactions from two experts on the question. First, Professor Helen Drake from Loughborough University, who will provide us with some reactions from more of a European member states perspective. And we will have Professor Bale, who will also give us more insightful analysis about the impact of the Brexit on British party politics. But before introducing you, our guest speaker tonight, let me introduce who we are and what we do. We are based at the School of Politics and International Relations, and we have, as a Center for European Research, a long-established tradition in providing an interdisciplinary forum for the promotion of research and teaching on Europe. The CER provides a home for the many different facets of Europe. Our expertise covers Europe integration, comparative European politics, including British politics, European Union studies. We host PhD students, postdocs, welcome visiting fellows. I think at this time, this crucial time of Brexit negotiations, and at the time also when UK universities are being asked to give the names of colleagues researching and teaching Europe, as well as their teaching material, research and teaching on European studies and academic freedom could not matter more. These are exciting times intellectually and scientifically for Europe and Britain. The Center for European Research enables this debate by promoting scientific rigor, public engagement. So please, if you are interested, do follow our work on social media. We have a Facebook page, a Twitter page, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Also, amongst the logistical detail, I need to attract your attention to the fire exits here and over there. But please let me now turn to our keynote speaker. When I was researching justice and home affairs policies, Jonathan Faull was certainly a name I couldn't miss since you were Director General of Justice and Home Affairs from 2003 until 2010, at a time, I think, of great expansion of these EU internal security and migration policies. Out of your 38-year-long career at the European Commission, you held many high-level positions, and I'm going only to highlight a few of them. You have worked in the private office of Leon Britton. At the time, he was a competition commissioner. You were also Director General of the Internal Market and Services from 2010 until 2015, and you ended your career as the Director General of the Task Force on the British referendum on membership of the European Union. You have authored many articles on European law, competition law. You've been visiting professor in many leading academic institutions. You are also on the advisory board of the Center for European Reform and the Institute Notre Europe. So tonight you will provide us with your views on the different stakes in the negotiations for the UK, EU institutions and EU member states. It seems at the moment Brexit negotiations are in a deadlock. We don't know if there will be what will come out of the phase one of the divorce and if there will be a deal in December. Many observers already call actually that negotiators are clashing already over future trade talks. So I think I will leave it here and leave you the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and Distinguished professors, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure, great honor for me to deliver this lecture this evening. I'd like to thank the Centre for European Reform, Queen Mary University, for hosting it, and I look forward to a discussion with you all a little later on. The Article 50 negotiations, as you know, are sort of underway. Perhaps the final real clash, the real engagement, think of a rugby scrum, hasn't started yet, but we have used up already several months of the 24-month period, and I should say immediately that I have played and play no part in those negotiations. I left the Commission at the beginning of this year, and I am in no way a part of Michel Barnier's team, and had no part either in the way it was set up. As you know, Mr. Barnier operates under a mandate conferred upon him by the Council of Ministers, in turn operating under guidelines set out by the European Council, the summit, the real heads of state or government. And they have identified three preliminary issues which they want to see, if not resolved, at least make sufficient progress for there to be a further meaningful discussion of what is called the second phase, that is to say, the beginning of a discussion of what the long-term relationship between this country and the European Union will look like. And that could have happened earlier this month. It is now, there's always a deadline looming ahead of us. Now everybody's thoughts are focused on December, when there will be another summit, another meeting of the European Council, and it is hoped, expected, feared, depending on your point of view, that the European Council will then say, yes, there has been sufficient progress for the second phase talks to begin, because remember Article 50, the provision of the Treaty on European Union under which all this is happening, that article provides for agreement on withdrawal, on the arrangements for withdrawal, and what that means is going to be important, I think, and on the taking into account of the framework for the leaving country's relationship with the European Union in the future. So if you have to take something into account, you have to know what it is. So some understanding of the framework of the future discussion, future relationship, is obviously going to be essential. Today, I don't think, frankly, that is particularly clear. We are in an extraordinary situation where it is believed on the continent, and I include Ireland, nonsense geographically, if you know what I mean, the 27, it is believed that it is for the British side to say what it wants in more detail than it has hitherto, which places the 27 in the relatively comfortable position of not having to determine very detailed positions themselves, because they're waiting for the British to make a further move. Now, the Prime Minister in her Florence speech did make a move, and it was welcomed as such. Now the talk is a further clarification on the three preliminary issues for the determination that sufficient progress has been made to be possible in December. The three preliminary issues, this is what the Brussels side has said, the 27 have said. British don't necessarily accept that these are preliminary issues, but that's the way the talks have been going, are money, people, so people stranded on either side of the new border when Brexit takes place, Britons in the 27 citizens in the United Kingdom, and finally Ireland. Ireland, of course, is in a complicated existential set of difficulties as a full member of the European Union, with the euro as its currency, but geographically attached to the United Kingdom with a land border, the only land border the United Kingdom has. I leave aside other odd bits of land border around the world, but the main land border anyway between the United Kingdom and Ireland is, of course, the land border in the north of Ireland, and that border has been many things in its rather complicated and often tragic history. It has never been a border between the European Union and a non-European Union country. And if it were to do all the things that external borders of the European Union normally do, it would be, frankly, unacceptable to all sides in Ireland, both parts of Ireland and the communities in Ireland, and frankly, to the United Kingdom as well. So the search is on, but I have to say that it's not easy, despite the much vaunted use of modern technologies. The search is on for a solution which maintains the Irish land border as it is today, a peaceful place which people pass without noticing very much has changed, except perhaps the colours of the road signs, while making it a border between the EU and a foreign country, which is a third country, as the Brussels jargon has it, which is what the United Kingdom wants to be and will become. So in December, the European Council will meet, and it may well decide that sufficient progress has been made on these three preliminary issues, and then 2018 becomes the really crucial year. Why? Because we made the argument, I'm going to use we in, you'll guess from the context, sometimes it's we British and sometimes it's we Europeans. I'm one of both, professionally and personally. So we made the Article 50 notification, and that's not ambiguous, only one party made it, in March of this year, which starts the 2-year period running, which expires on the 29th of March 2019. Now, it can be extended if everybody agrees that it should be extended. That is not on the agenda at the moment. The safe assumption is that everybody's planning for March 2019 to be Brexit Day. That, of course, contains a lot of assumptions about what parliaments on both sides may or may not do, but let's assume for present purposes that that will happen. If you work backwards from March 2019 and take into account the time needed for the preparation and then the conduct of governmental and parliamentary approval processes, and on the European side that means translation into lots and lots of different languages, and governments consulting coalition members, and finally, European Parliament, and a meaningful role seems to be the expression used of Parliament here, meaningful role for the British Parliament, everybody agreeing, who has to agree, then you can no doubt not use for negotiating purposes the 3 months of 2019, which means essentially we have 12 months from today. Certainly 12 months from Christmas, in which the negotiations have to be conducted and concluded. As I said, I think the real engagement on issues of substance is still to come. There have been a lot of discussions, no doubt, discussions that we know little about behind the scenes, but the discussion of issues of detail, and there are many of them, is going to have to take place essentially during the course of 2018, assuming that sufficient progress has been made until by then. Now, to understand what's going on, one has to go back a little bit into the history of the relations between this country and its continent, and the way its continent has organized itself into what has become the European Union in the post-war years. The first thing to say is that the UK had carved out for itself, we're still members, carved out for itself a series of exceptions and special statuses and opt-outs from bits of European integration it didn't like. We were not alone in that, but we certainly had more of them than anybody else. The Danes have a few, the Polish have 1 or 2, but we had more than any others, which meant that in the European Council's agreement with the British government led by David Cameron in February 2016, it was able to enumerate all the ways in which the UK already was different from all the others, and come to the logical conclusion that ever closer union, these words which have been in the treaties from the very beginning, had not prevented this situation from coming about, and did not bind the United Kingdom to any further steps in European integration, which it didn't want to take. Most people thought, frankly, that that was already the case and it didn't necessarily need to be said again, but since apparently in some circles in this country those words caused alarm and gave the impression, frankly on a misreading, that they were propelling the country on a never-ending process of further integration towards, I don't know what, that wasn't the case, and it was said very clearly that it wasn't the case. The agreement with Mr. Cameron also said that the United Kingdom didn't have to join the euro. Didn't have to join the euro. We have an opt-out from the euro. We didn't join the euro, and no doubt any British minister today, in fact, any British politician, I think, would say we have no intention of joining the euro. Fine. And that should not get in the way, that status of being outside the euro should not get in the way of the normal operation of the single European market in the financial area. So there can be no discrimination, said the leaders, on the basis of currency, on the basis of location of financial activities, as to whether they're in the Eurozone or not. That was, I think, already the case, but it was codified, it was stated very clearly. And then there was the difficult question of free movement of workers, not the same as, and sometimes confused with, the free movement of people, and further, not the same as, but often confused in this country at least, with the general issue of immigration. And there, the settlement with Mr. Cameron said that the British had identified their social security system as a pull factor, as an incentive to immigration which might not have taken place, or free movement of workers from other member states into the UK, which might not have taken place otherwise, and therefore the social security system could be tweaked in a way so as to remove that incentive by phasing in and not having immediate eligibility for in-work, non-contributory social security benefits by the very fact that someone had started work. This whole agreement with Mr. Cameron, by the way, on its own terms is now lifeless, because if the referendum had one legal consequence, and lawyers, I think, and some of you will be lawyers, usually say that referendums have, in this country's constitution, have political significance, certainly, but have no legally binding effect. That the Supreme Court said that in the Miller judgment. But the one legal consequence it did have was it blew up, it caused a self-destruct, this agreement which Mr. Cameron reached in 2016, which, by the way, the British government deposited at the United Nations as a treaty, where, for all I know, it is now gathering dust, unless somebody in the Foreign Office has thought to take it away. Now, all that is by way of history. A further point of history, which I think probably explains something about attitudes in this country and why they are different from those in many other European countries. I accept that many of the issues which were discussed in the referendum campaign are shared in varying degrees with other member states of the Union, but I don't think any other country had the full cocktail of issues, and I don't think any other country had the same starting point in the way it thinks about Europe as we do in this country. And I'd like to say a few words about the difficulties that people like me have in explaining the UK to our continental friends these days, because a lot of people who thought they knew us pretty well are realizing that there is more to the United Kingdom than meets their usually admiring eyes. First of all, we had told them for years, don't call us England. It's very insulting to the rest of the country. This is in fact, the United Kingdom. It is a rather strange country because it has parliaments in some parts of it, but not in England, which is actually the biggest part of it. So it's gone through this process of asymmetrical devolution, but it works. Just as we say to our friends, don't go looking for a constitution of the United Kingdom in your library because you won't find one, but we do have one. And actually it's a very good one, and it's worked very well. It's been honed down through the ages by legislators, by judges, professors, even occasional letters to the editor of the Times. So go to your library and read books by Dicey and Erskine May and the Cabinet Manual, lots of legislation which may or may not be entrenched, and a few judiciously chosen cases and works by legal academics, and there you will have the British Constitution. And you will find that any conceivable question is answered. Problem is, the first question that came up in the interpretation of Article 50, which nobody had predicted, it's full of ambiguous phrases, this Article 50, but it started off very simply. Any member state may, in accordance with its constitutional principles, notify to the others that it intends to withdraw from the European Union. Those words, in accordance with its constitutional principles, seem sort of motherhood and apple pie, copperplate language. We use it all the time in Brussels. In the UK, it gave rise to a massive row about who had the constitutional right to notify the European Union that the country intended to withdraw from it. Is it the government? Is it the Parliament? Henry VIII was mentioned, and other such wonderful historical issues, and eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we had the frankly appalling spectacle of the Supreme Court judges being called enemies of the people, which is an expression which reverberated around Europe in a very chilling way. So we had boastfully told our friends in the continent that we were it's an island, or an island and a bit, and one which was peopled and governed by rational, pragmatic people, not given to great ideological passion. British politicians, British officials, even British European officials, were well known for arguing all the time that before you start finding a solution to a problem, let's first talk about whether there's a problem in the first place, instead of reaching for a blank sheet of paper and designing great European things, which we accuse other member states, I won't mention, of doing it. And we told them that we have the best parliament, the best civil service, the best diplomats, uninterrupted traditions. Now, we're not alone in hubris of that sort, but we were probably the best at persuading others that there might be some truth in it. Then we came back to our constitution, the structure of the country, where's England, what happened to that, and we told them about the different levels of devolution that have taken place in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We started talking mysteriously about Salisbury and Sewell conventions, Barnett formulae, concordats. Some of them knew what that was. They thought it was something to do with the Vatican. The Good Friday Agreement, Henry VIII again, and we talked to people about Gibraltar, but, and I'm ashamed to say this, some of us forgot Anguilla, which might also have border problems of its own. We also explained to our colleagues that we had fixed-term parliaments. Like you, we said to most of them, we used to have a system where the Prime Minister goes to the Queen, and then there'll be an election pretty quickly. We don't do that anymore. We've got something called a Fixed-Term Parliament Act, And they all heard the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, Mrs. May, after a referendum saying she did not intend to have an election. And of course she did, there was. And then we got a result with no outright majority. Now that didn't shock any of my continental friends because they get that all the time. So they said, oh, I know what you're going to do. You'll have a grand coalition. You've got this big national issue. The country's divided. Obviously, you'll have a grand coalition. And we said, no, obviously, we won't have a grand coalition. We don't do that in peacetime. And we passed around copies of the Democratic Unionist Party's manifesto. And they began to be familiar, those that needed to, with the intricacies of Northern Irish politics. So, these friends of mine who read the FT, read The Economist, many of whom have studied in august institutions like this, watch the BBC occasionally, come to London, that's part of the problem, they don't go anywhere else, thought they knew this country, began to wonder whether they really did. Now, is the UK exceptional in its attitudes to the UK? My submission is, if you take the sum of all the different British attitudes to the EU, probably yes. But, as I said, many of the concerns that the British people have, insofar as one can discern them with the European Union, many of them are shared individually or in different combinations in other European countries. But there are differences between us British, and our attitude to the European Union from those of other member states. Remember a few factors. Many European Union countries have been dictatorships in recent history, of the right or of the left. And they see the European Union as a democratic bulwark and certificate of modernity. The former Soviet or Warsaw Pact members of the European Union see the European Union, as part of their new independent international identity and as part of the protection against Russia. Former colonies, and there are several of them among the member states, several British colonies, by the way, see the Union as a strong symbol of independence and international identity. Countries which occupied others or were occupied by Nazi Germany during the war see the European Union as a peace and reconciliation project, and countries tied to the German economy for a large part of their trade and prosperity want to be inside the meeting rooms where economic decisions are taken with Germany. Countries which do not want the continent of Europe to be dominated by a single country, and they include Germany, by the way, and they used to include the United Kingdom, I hope they still do, see the EU as the best way to achieve that. Countries sharing the euro as their currency, or aspiring to do so, want to keep it and participate in the making of monetary policy together in the European Central Bank. The thought of abandoning the euro, re-establishing what would become a revalued or a devalued national currency, and redenominating everything is a major incentive, whatever you think of the euro, once you've got it, to stick to it. We saw that most recently in Marine Le Pen's unsuccessful campaign to be President of France, with many reasons why she lost or why Mr. Macron won. But those of you who watch the television debates will remember that she was totally incapable of explaining what her currency policy would be, because having said that she would abandon the euro and reinstate the franc, she ended up saying, well, we'll keep the euro externally, we'll have the franc internally, and Mr. Macron didn't really have to make much of an effort to expose that policy as incredible. Now, those descriptions are of, I think, many, if not all, of the member states. The UK doesn't fit into any of those descriptions. Our history is different, our geographical location is different, maybe not as different as we think, but that explains why there is a certain British exceptionalism, which means that while other countries agreed with many British positions and were perfectly happy to let the British take the lead and take the flak for them, they will not follow us to the exit. They will miss us. They feel orphaned, bereft, some of them, but they and the EU will change once we have left as the pack is reshuffled. The European Union will change because the United Kingdom has made a massive contribution to the way the European Union functions and its policies today. Nobody will go back to pre-1973. The EU will not go back to the common market of 1972, and the United Kingdom is not going to go back to the way it was in 1972. We will all change in different ways, and how we change will be influenced by other big powers in the world, Russia, China, the United States, all changing in different ways, and it's very hard today to predict exactly which way we will all go. But the European Union is today, I think, in the relatively easy phase of being determined to show its unity around the negotiating package it put together in the mandate for Mr. Barnier. That will be tested when the real negotiations get underway, because the 27 countries, of course, each have their national interests, and the Brussels system will have to channel those national interests into an evolving European position. I know that there is a lot of talk at the moment about the risks of no agreement being reached. That is certainly a risk. The clock is ticking, and unless there's unanimous agreement, March 2019 comes around, and by virtue of the law in the treaty, the United Kingdom ceases to be a member state. Some people say that means falling back on WTO terms. It does, but I would just finish by saying two things about the WTO terms issue. One is that very few countries in the world have relations with the EU solely on the basis of the WTO. Take the United States. Obviously, we don't have, we talked about it, but the EU does not have a free trade agreement with the United States, but there are many individual bilateral agreements between the European and the United States on civil aviation, on insurance, on sharing data for security purposes, on protecting that data for privacy purposes, and so on and so on. And secondly, a fundamental point, trade today, particularly in the continent of Europe, is not really governed by tariffs or the absence thereof. It is governed by regulation. We all live in what I hope are reasonably advanced, sophisticated societies in which we can argue about how much, we want to protect the environment and consumers and investors and workers, etc. We do that by regulating goods and services. And we trade on the basis that we trust each other, that we have the same within the European Union, or beyond it, similar levels of protection of all those things, so a similar level of regulation, in return for which goods and services are crossing borders freely. That is the system which the United Kingdom will leave if it doesn't have something to put in its place. The rest of Europe, the rest of the continent of Europe, one way or another, operates under Brussels rules. It may not be in the room where they're made, but it uses those rules to make things and create services which it trades into the rest of Europe, which for every European country is their major trading partner. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for this insightful views focus on British exceptionalism as well, visibly explaining how Britain functions also to Europeans. I would like briefly to introduce Helen and Tim. So Professor Helen Drake from Loughborough University is actually also an expert of French politics, and she's the leader of an ESRC project on 28 plus perspective on Brexit. She's the director of the Academy of Diplomacy and International Governance at Loughborough University, and she's also the chair of the UK Leading University Association for Contemporary European Studies, and it would be really interesting to hear about the French position, also how maybe President Macron has been trying to factor in different scenarios on the Brexit. And then my colleague Tim Bale, who's also an expert on party politics in Britain, and is actually leading an ESRC project on UK party membership in the 21st century. So I think it will be interesting to know how decisive will the stance on Europe be in future British party politics. And just to keep your attention, just to remind you that after the talk, we will have you all very much welcome to drinks as well. So please, Helen.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So Sarah's introduction serves as the disclaimers that I was going to make at the beginning. The first is that I am I'm working with my colleagues from Loughborough and Queen Mary, Stein, on a project called 28 Plus Perspectives on Brexit, where we're researching, we're looking into what the others think. So 28 plus, as in there are 28 member states, and the plus is the EU institutions. So any good bits are all from my colleagues' work that might follow. And the second thing, Sarah said that it just made me sound really busy, but I do want to come back to the fact, so I do chair this association. Academics kind of gather together around conferences and journals, and I chair the Association for Contemporary European Studies, and we've got about 1,000 members over about 50 countries, many of whom are in Europe. This isn't just a plug. The point I want to get to is that UACES began in 1967, which is 50 years ago, so we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary, sort of ironic really, because UACES got together because a group of British scholars in universities in the UK were appalled that Britain had been rejected twice from the EEC in 63 and 67, and they wanted to get together to educate themselves and students about the continent, as they called it, and the other member states and what they were doing. And that really spawned a number of European studies degrees and so on and so forth. The reason I mention this is that we felt that we recently had to put out a statement in the last week or so supporting our members in their kind of attempts to continue to teach about Europe with academic freedom and academic integrity, because we feel that probably now is a really good time for us to be teaching about Europe, both the EU and its member states, in UK's universities, 50 years after we began this. And I think that's a disclaimer, because I think that the fact that, I'm trying not to be critical here, but the fact that we don't really have much left in the UK in the way of European studies departments or degrees or courses, that's why it's so important here, what you do here, because that's sort of the cultural backdrop for what we're witnessing, what Sir Jonathan just sort of outlined for us, that what we're witnessing with the withdrawal of the UK from the EU is the political dimension of 43/44 years of membership. So by political, I mean enter the parties that you're going to talk about, Tim, enter the press, enter the people, the will of the people, the theatre, the spectacle, and the emotions. around the UK's membership. And really, I think the UK has sort of gone for 43, 44 years without that political dimension being to the fore. And I think it's largely because of the politicisation of the UK's membership that it explains what I think it would be fair to say on the other side of the channel certainly were initially quite emotional reactions to the result of the referendum in 2016. So reactions, I mean, Sir Jonathan said that they'll miss us. And again, we did encounter reactions expressed in emotional terms, shock, surprise, regret, and actually, frankly, incredulity. Because, again, as was said in the keynote speech, the UK has a really good reputation, correct me if I'm wrong, please, but in the EU as a really as a good negotiator, as having great expertise, as having managed to negotiate and consolidate a rather special status for the UK in the EU. We could say it's almost sort of the Westminster-Whitehall dichotomy, so where Westminster is where the theatre of politics takes place and where all the drama is happening now, against 4 decades worth of very highly reputed administrative and bureaucratic expertise on the part of the UK representatives in Brussels that arrived at the sort of the status that Sir Jonathan mentioned, whereby the UK had a pretty sweet deal in the EU, and so the other EU member states have reacted with some, should we just say, surprise at what's currently developed, at what's developed since. It seems like chalk and cheese. So having said that, in terms of how the others have reacted, I think it's also been mentioned there has been a good deal of unity. You know, here in the UK, we see that portrayed as them ganging up on us. Well, it's not really quite like that for now. The EU27 and the institutions are rather unified around the values of the European Union, around the survival of the European Union. It's largely governments, the executives, that are speaking on behalf of the 27. You asked me about Macron and France. Again, it depends which papers you read, doesn't it? But, you know, it's not hard to find messages about how, the French, etc., are going to get back in and they're going to, etc., finish what they started, etc. And it's true that I think President Macron's language and approach to the EU is very interesting at the moment. It's relentlessly positive. It's not particularly original in French terms, but he's sort of going for it, for a political union, a European Union, and this very, very sort of positive message. And I reread his speech that he gave in the Sorbonne, and he talked about the EU28, and I thought, somebody's made a mistake. But then I read on, and no, in Macron's vision of the future of Europe, the UK is still there. It's just in sort of a different sphere and a different circle of influence in this future of Europe, which I thought was quite sort of smart on his part. So for now, I think it is the UK governments rather than parties and parliaments and lobbies that have really been discussing Brexit. And my colleague Stein in the group, who's here at Queen Mary, your initial research on certain member states, so the Netherlands, France and Germany, looking at the elections that have been held this year, shows really that Brexit was just a non-issue, or not salient as we call it. It really wasn't much of a deal. And in none of those elections did Brexit seem to bring about, again quoting my colleague, a domino effect. You know, we're not seeing other exits for now. The hard Eurosceptics, whether on the left or the right, don't really seem to have pushed through. They're still there, and they're still very sort of latent in their opposition to the EU. But so far, we haven't seen Brexit really create amongst the politics of the other member states much of a reaction. But to finish, it's true as well that EU governments, EU27 governments, are engaging with their civil societies, with their stakeholders. They're making contingency plans, and as was said at the end, this is probably, the relatively easy phase of negotiations for Britain to withdraw, and perhaps when the EU when the talks get onto the substance, then the variable exposure of the EU 27 member states to Brexit risk and opportunity will put stresses on the unity that we see at the moment. But I mean, Brexit will happen, and it will happen in one form or another. And the EU 27 will, as was said, it will look rather different without the UK. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you very much. Sir Jonathan mentioned Theresa May calling the election after she had promised, or at least her spokespeople had promised faithfully on several occasions not to do it. And I wanted to start really with the general election, because I think the general election does suggest, given the amount of research we've been able to do on it at the moment, that there has been already a kind of electoral restructuring in this country, which derives from the result of and the voting in that referendum. If you look at the election in 2017, you will see that identity and values, and to some extent age, which interacts with both of those, seem to be very powerful motivators for people switching from where you would expect them perhaps to vote to a different party. So we had the, I guess in some ways, sort of strange situation in which the Conservatives' biggest gains were among working class voters, and Labour's biggest gains were among middle class voters. And I think that is a Brexit effect. But that was fascinating, partly because the election wasn't, to Theresa May's dismay, actually about Brexit. She and the Conservative Party clearly wanted an election that was based on that theme, and in particular around which party was best placed to get a good deal for the UK. But it was evident very early on in that election that actually the Conservative Party wasn't going to be able to set the agenda in the way that it had assumed, and the kind of bread and butter issues that generally feature in elections in this country came to the fore. And if you looked at people's concerns, and you looked at the way they responded to opinion poll questions about which is the biggest issue facing you and your family in particular, which is a big driver, some would say, of voting, it certainly wasn't Brexit. It was the NHS, it was the economy, it was education, all the things you would expect. And one of the strange paradoxes really of where we've gotten ourselves to in UK politics over the last decade or so is we have fallen out about and made a huge decision on something that actually for most people really isn't very important at all. One of the other, I think, fascinating paradoxes we see, not only in the election but generally if you look at opinion research right now, is that after a referendum in which we were told that the key factor was the ability of Leave to fuse concerns about the EU with concerns about immigration, those concerns, in particular the concerns about immigration, are beginning to drop away. Immigration as an issue for the British people is clearly still important, but it's nowhere near as important as it used to be. It seems to have dropped out of the top 3, even the top 5 issues for people. Whether that is because somehow people think that by voting for Brexit and by taking back control, that has already occurred, or whether they see some change in the numbers coming through, and quite why those numbers are changing is an interesting fact. I don't know, but it is a paradox that this big issue for people, immigration, seems to be dropping away, and as I say, the EU was never that big an issue in any case. I'd also say that, of course, if we talk about the election as being about identity and about values and to some extent education and age, interacting with those, that doesn't necessarily mean that change is permanent. We ought not to assume that just because the election in 2017 seem to be showing those characteristics as driving people's vote, that they will do equally in future elections. So I thought I'd take a quick look at the parties and just really throw out a few sort of thoughts, really, so maybe we can discuss them later on. First of all, we are looking obviously at parties that are split, but the splits inside each party, at least the two main parties, are incredibly asymmetric in a way. We often talk about the Conservative Party as being divided on Europe, and sometimes we get the impression that actually, you know, the main problem for the Conservative Party is that nearly all of them are hard Brexiteers, and that's the problem for Theresa May. One of the amazing things, however, really about the split in the Conservative Party is that it is actually probably 50-50 at the very least. There are very large numbers of Conservative MPs still in Parliament who did not want to leave the EU and who regard leaving the EU as a very, very bad idea. And one of the, I think, interesting things to speculate on is why they are so quiet and why they've been so quiet for so long, these people, unless you include the sort of handful of supposed pro-Europeans who occasionally talk a good game but never actually seem to vote in Parliament in a way that would suggest they really mean it. How long can that actually carry on? How long will all those Conservative MPs who voted to remain and who clearly still, I think, have, you know, at least in private, you know, very large concerns about Brexit, will actually keep quiet and allow this thing to happen? It may be, of course, that they're worried about their membership, and, you know, our research shows that Conservative Party members voted 70-30 approximately in favour of leaving. But they also have to think about their constituencies, and of course large numbers of Conservative Party politicians do not represent constituencies which voted to leave the European Union, and nor do those Conservative MPs fear UKIP anymore. What has been you know, another obvious feature of the effect of the referendum has been, you know, not the death necessarily of UKIP, but at the very least it's on life support, I think we could say. It's in the intensive care ward. It's in a coma at the moment, and it doesn't look like it's going to be getting up anytime soon, which in some senses takes some of the pressure off the Remain MPs in the Conservative Party, and yet we haven't really seen them move yet. We're assuming that they won't, but maybe there will be a change there. As for Labour, obviously the split again is rather different in the sense that there are a very, very small number of Eurosceptics in the Labour Party. I think even among the leadership, you know, who some people doubt their Europhilia, and for good reason, given Jeremy Corbyn's performance in the referendum campaign, there is a general feeling that certainly Brexit probably isn't that great an idea, and certainly a hard Brexit is a very bad idea indeed, and that a cliff edge Brexit is even worse. And yet, we still have Labour essentially going along, for the moment anyway, with what is happening. Refusing, if you like, to try and lead public opinion, and instead watching public opinion very carefully. Whether, if public opinion does shift, you will then see Labour shift its position, I think will be really interesting to see. There are clearly a lot of Labour MPs worried about their Leave constituencies, but on the other hand, I think even those Labour MPs are very concerned about the possible economic damage that may be done by Brexit, and maybe wonder whether, you know, they really do need to start perhaps rethinking the party's position on that. Having said that, of course, there doesn't seem to be much pressure on Labour, because at the moment its ambivalent stance, its ambiguous stance, doesn't seem to be doing the party any harm whatsoever. And many of us sitting here may sometimes think, oh, well, you know, how can they cope with this cognitive dissonance between, you know, on the one hand, them voting for Article 50 and wanting it to go through, Brexit to happen, and on the other hand, their knowledge that, you know, perhaps it's not a great idea. Well, I think the political parties are capable of coping with that kind of thing far more than perhaps some of us in this room. So I wouldn't expect Labour to move too quickly unless we see a big shift in public opinion. As for the other parties, very, very quickly, the SNP, I think, were rather scarred by the general election. I think the SNP, in trying to somehow fuse concerns about Brexit with their independence rhetoric, I think has been badly burned, and I don't think we're going to see them be as assertive about the EU as perhaps once they might have been. And perhaps the same goes for the Liberal Democrats. I think many Liberal Democrats are very wary about being seen as the party of the EU and wanting to stay in the EU. I think the general election suggested that possibly isn't that great a stance for them. It's maybe their kind of unique selling point, but it's not a particularly effective one. And then, of course, you have the DUP, which is in the weirdly paradoxical position of, on the one hand, saying it supports Brexit, but on the other hand, saying that there must not be any kind of hard border between the Republic and Northern Ireland. It's a very difficult circle to square. So, finishing up then, what should we expect of MPs? Well, from my point of view, I think actually there's a lot of what psychologists would term learned helplessness in the House of Commons at the moment. I think the majority of MPs in Parliament clearly believe that Brexit might not be that good an idea, but also seem to think that it will definitely go ahead and that it should go ahead, despite all their misgivings. That, to me, is in some ways an abrogation of their role as representatives. It seems to me that MPs risk becoming either, at worst, lobby fodder for leaders with whom they don't agree, or at best, delegates for their constituencies which have voted one way or another. And to finish up, I think the other thing to think about is Parliament has, I think, just about got out of David Davis and Theresa May now the idea that there will be a meaningful vote before we leave, rather than, as Mr. Davis suggested last week, after we leave, in which case how can it be a meaningful vote? But what will that vote actually be on? It seems obvious that the government's intention is to make sure that the choice is between a deal that is negotiated with the EU 27 on the one hand, or crashing out of the EU with absolutely no deal on the other. And that seems to me to stretch the idea of a meaningful vote beyond all reasonable understanding. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would suggest that maybe our keynote speaker and discussants keep their remarks for a short while we are maybe turning to the audience for a Q&A session as well. Please, if you have any questions, we have microphones which are available, and if you could introduce yourself very briefly. I see a gentleman here, there, 1, 2, 3. Yes, we'll have, I think, at least 2 rounds. Yeah, go ahead.
Not working. Is there another one?
Oh?
Yeah.
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 Okay, sorry.
Yes.
My name's Robin. I'm just a member of the public, but I was a volunteer with Stronger In. My question would be about, it doesn't seem that it's going to be quite so easy as some of the panel are saying to get to the next round of the negotiations. And then there seems to be another 20 billion still to come, whether the Conservative Party will accept that. But if we do get on to the next round, it seems that you are going to say we either have the equivalent of the Canadian deal, which is basically going to hammer the service sector, or we're going to have an EEA deal, and then we might stay a lot closer for the economy, but have no control on the regulation. So I just wonder what Jonathan and Tim and the panel think about which Britain will go for, whether it will accept that dichotomy, whether the EU will cave in and do have a cherry-picking deal in between those two. Thank you.
Thank you. over there. Yeah.
My name's Richard Kirker. I would like to emphasise how much I agree with Tim's description that Parliament's failure so far, and if it continues to fail to resist the momentum towards Brexit in whatever form, would, in my opinion, be an abrogation of their responsibilities. I cannot forgive Parliament for having to be told through the Supreme Court that it was the sovereign body that rules this country. Up to that point, Parliament seemed quite willing not to accept that responsibility. And it was up to ordinary people who had to dip into their pockets to pay for the court case, which ended up at the Supreme Court, that led Parliament to have a vote on whether or not the Brexit process should begin. I think that tells you all you need to know about the spinelessness of politicians in this country. And that's what's turned me into a full-time anti-Brexit campaigner. And I make absolutely no apology for being a dedicated campaigner to keep Britain in, regardless of what our weak politicians wish the destiny of the country to be. The referendum was purely advisory. There was no legal obligation to accept its results. Parliament could quite honourably have said, yes, we've noted the result, this knife-edge result. It strengthens our position to get a few more concessions, but we don't have to follow the result towards the exit gate. And as the Speaker, who will be here next week, so helpfully pointed out in an interview in the House magazine last week, I believe, Parliament is fully within its right to reject Brexit, if it so chooses to do so. So my question is, how, on cue, how can those of us who do not wish to collude with this disastrous policy of our country isolating itself from Europe prevent that happening?
Okay. How we can change the scenario. And there were this gentleman here, you and here, and then we'll have the answers from the panel. Yes.
Hi, my name's Matt, and a question for anyone on the panel, but of a more legal nature. In light of the Court of Justice's decision with regard to the free trade deal with Singapore, given the fact that the UK wants to bundle a lot of its current agreements with the EU into a future trade agreement, what do you think the European perspective, bear in mind any future trade deal will require the agreement of all 27 nations, including Wallonia and everything we've had before, that even if we agree a deal at first level, that a deal could ultimately be rejected when it comes to member state agreement?
Thank you. This lady over there, next to you, almost. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Abby Semple. I'm a researcher and consultant on EU law. And I'd be interested in the panel's views on how and why the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice became a red line for the UK's negotiations, and how do the other EU member states perceive that red line?
Thank you. And very last, for this round, I'll take a second one later on here, please.
Andrew Smith. This is a question for Sir Jonathan. Just looking back again, do you think that Cameron had an opportunity to get a stronger deal in terms of, particularly interested in terms of immigration, as that seems to have been become such an issue, such a salient issue in the referendum? And also, do you think the other EU member states, EU 27, now regret not giving him stronger terms?
Thank you very much. Would you like to start?
Okay, I'll try and be brief. One man's bespoke agreement is another woman's cherry picking. And it's true that has to be resolved. I mean, Brussels operates most easily on the basis of precedents. Things that have been done once are easier to do again than starting from scratch. It's a long process among the 27 and the Brussels institutions to build up a new policy. Once you've done it, it's on the shelf. It's a convenient package to use again. That is why the Brussels mindset is, UK, you want to leave? Well, here we have a shelf, and here's Norway, and here's Switzerland, here's Canada. take your pick. Now, the UK, reasonably enough, says, I am neither Norway nor Canada nor Switzerland. I want something else. The real question, and that's not unreasonable, the real question is what exactly does it want? And Brussels thinks that London has not yet said exactly what it wants. Does it want 3 of the 4 fundamental freedoms, but not free movement of workers? What does it want to do about the Court of Justice? Is it opposed to any adjudication involving foreign judges, or would it accept something else? We don't know the answers to these questions. Parliament's failure, I think you're a little uncharitable. I never thought I would sit here saying this, but I think you're a little uncharitable. I mean, it was by no means clear, as a matter of British constitutional law, precisely how far the executive power to make and unmake treaties went. And even if we'd had a 500-page written constitution, it might not have answered that point. So I don't think you are being fair with respect to Parliament, saying it just wasn't doing its job properly by not asserting the right to make the Article 50 notification alone. It was not unreasonable on the part of the government to think that it could do it. After all, the executive makes treaties. That was its argument. Therefore, the executive can unmake treaties. That's the British constitutional system. The question is whether this particular treaty, which had required parliamentary approval for effect to be given to its rules in the European Communities Act in 1972, required an act to undo it. So spinelessness and all that, I think you're a little unfair. You went on to say, how can Parliament reject Brexit? Well, with great difficulty. What Parliament will be asked to do, if there's an agreement concluded between the negotiators, is to approve that agreement. The leaving of the European Union takes place at midnight on whenever it is, the 29th of March 2019, simply by virtue of the operation of the treaty. Parliament might find it difficult to stop that. It can resolve, it can call upon the government to seek an extension, but only to seek, because the others would have to agree. It can call upon the government to withdraw the notification. But lawyers argue about whether you can withdraw the notification. Is it revocable or not? So it's not as easy as all that to imagine what the Parliament's significant role is going to be. The Singapore Agreement, yes, for those who don't follow these things, there is in the EU's constitution now, which is also beautiful and unwritten, by the way, there is a great argument about precisely how far the EU's sole responsibility for concluding a trade agreement goes, and where it ends, and where the states themselves, the 28 today, have their own responsibility. And in a recent opinion of the Court of Justice regarding agreement with Singapore, the court shifted the cursor a little bit. So to simplify outrageously, in fact, basically pure trade is EU, but investment matters, protection of investment, that is a matter of shared competence between the EU and the member states, so all the member states have to agree. That means that any comprehensive future relationship agreement is almost certainly a mixed agreement, which indeed will require approval by all member states in accordance with their respective constitutional requirements, which in many countries means Parliament, may in some countries even be referendum. Nobody said that yet, but you can't rule it out. And in the glorious kingdom of Belgium, a country I know and love dearly, that means subnational regional parliaments, and there are many of them in Belgium. Small country, but it has many component parts. So the fully comprehensive, the BAFTA, bold and ambitious free trade agreement the Prime Minister talks about, it's a new type of BAFTA, is likely to take quite some time to negotiate and quite some time to approve and ratify, and it may come a cropper at some stage, which leaves everybody looking a huge mess. That means that any transition between leaving in March 19 and the final entry into force of that agreement may be quite a long one. but we will have to see. Why have people taken against the Court of Justice in this country? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I can think of several possibilities. One is simple confusion with the European Court of Human Rights, because people say Luxembourg is giving the right of votes to prisoners, whereas it's Strasbourg, which has nothing to do with the EU, European Court of Human Rights, which says that a blanket ban on prisoners' votes violates the European Convention of Human Rights. Completely different things, but maybe people are mixing them up. I think there is a fairly widespread view in some circles in this country that the European Court of Justice is a federalist institution, that when facing a choice between two possible interpretations, it gives the more federal interpretation. I don't think it's always true. What is true, though, is that Britain and British lawyers are not used to a system of constitutional review of legislation, which is what the Court of Justice does. It's given us, if you like, in the areas for which the EU is responsible, and they've grown over the years, we have a higher body of law than Parliament. That's the way the EU works. And it has to be like, you can't have 28 countries being fully sovereign inside the EU system. You wouldn't have an EU system. And secondly, the Court of Justice looks at, it's the way it interprets a rule, it looks at the purpose for which the rule was made, a purposive interpretation system. It's a system, remember, which operates in 24 languages, all of which are equal, although some are obviously more equal than others in the sense that most things are thought in French and written in bad English. But all languages are equal, and the Court of Justice has to decide what a word means. It looks at 24 different language versions. How does it go about interpreting? A British judge, or at least an English, I don't know much about Scots law, to be honest, an English judge, I was taught in my undergraduate days, looks at the plain meaning of the word. You look at a dictionary. What would the normally constituted English person understand this word to mean? That's what it means. And if Parliament actually meant something else, Parliament made a mistake, Parliament should re-legislate. That is the classic English law way of dealing with. It's changed over the years a bit. The European system's not like that. And we joined late. We were rebuffed twice. We finally got in 73. We confirmed in a referendum in 75. The EU system was up and running by the time we joined. And it has this system which English judges have adapted very well to and have influenced, but it's not the fundamental way in which the English legal system works. So the Court of Justice, no doubt, became a symbol of that. Does everybody agree with everything the Court of Justice does? Of course not. Every member state will have gripes, loses cases, thinks they're crazy, thinks they're wrong, as we all do about all courts. But under the rule of law, you accept it. Court judgment's a court judgment. You appeal as high as you can go, and then you live with it. Another problem with the European system, I'm afraid, sorry, this is getting long, is that in a national system, if you don't like a court interpretation of a rule, you change the rule. In the European system, it's very hard to change the rule. If the rule's in the treaty, it's incredibly hard to change it. If it's in legislation, it's pretty hard to change it. And the European Commission has a lock on the legislative system. You have to persuade the European Commission to propose a change in the legislation. So if you're a member state, you lose a case in the court, you think the court actually misunderstood the legislation, you have to go knocking on the door of the Commission, say, "Dear Commission, look what the court has done. Please propose amendment to the legislation." Then it has to go through all the system of Commission, Council, Parliament, trilogue to reconcile and so on. So it can be an inflexible system. I think we have to accept that. Finally, the Cameron deal. If Mr. Cameron had got more, would he have won the referendum? I don't know. I didn't vote. I lived abroad too long. I wasn't here at the time. You tell me. By the question, most people mean if he had got a numerical cap If he had been able to say, I will limit the number of people entering the country to something, N thousand people per year, would that have satisfied the British people? I don't know. Could he have got that? I think with, I was about to say, with great difficulty, probably he could not have got it without a treaty change, because the treaty is based on rights, not unconditional rights, in fact very conditional rights. But if you meet all the conditions to go to work in another member state, you're entitled to do it. It's a rights-based system. And if you're the 10,001st or the 9,999th, you have the same rights if you meet the conditions. So it's very hard to adapt that sort of rights-based system to an arithmetical cap. So the advice everybody gave Mr. Cameron, even before he made his request, even before the Tory manifesto was written in 2015, was numerical cap, no, you'll have to amend the treaty, and God knows what sort of Pandora's box we'd be opening if we opened the treaty, because everybody would have their favourite treaty amendments, and you've promised something by the end of 2017, and that's clearly not the right timescale for treaty amendments. So staying within today's treaties, very difficult to have a numerical cap, but you've said that the social security system operates as a pull factor, so we'll let you change the social security system. And a few other things to make it more difficult to move around the EU without having an actual job, which were conceded.
Thank you very much. Maybe, Tim, you have some reaction on Cameron or on the party?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the question of David Cameron, I mean, it was an example of someone, as Jonathan implied, really, creating expectations that couldn't possibly be met, and therefore being damaged, I think, in the campaign in the referendum, because he couldn't meet those expectations. And one of the other problems, I think, for Cameron with regard to the EU 27 was not only were they reluctant to give him, or maybe even, as Jonathan suggested, found it impossible to give him what he wanted, but they were convinced by him, in some ways, that he would win this referendum come what may, that he was a winner, and they shouldn't worry too much about it. So on the one hand, he was telling them that. On the other hand, he was trying to convince them unless they gave him this, that, or the other, there would be a disaster. And I think there was a bit of a disjunction between the two things. And in the end, I think they looked, as many people did at that referendum, and thought it was winnable with the package that they'd given him. So I'm not sure they would have given him any more. I won't deal with all the questions. They were great questions. In terms of what can people do to reverse Brexit or make Brexit not happen, I mean, I think it will be incredibly difficult. But I mean, it really comes down in the end, I think, to two things. One is actually stiffening the resolve of people in the Labour Party to actually take a harder line. And there are large numbers of people in the Labour Party who want to, and of course, again, if going back to our party membership surveys, I mean, it's about sort of 80-20 really in terms of the ordinary members of the Labour Party, in terms of wanting to stay in, and certainly stay in the single market and stay in the customs union. So there's a lot of room in the Labour Party, I think, to campaign. But also, actually, in the end, I think the most important thing is the Conservative Party. We're talking about the kind of intra-party mode in Parliament, the over-the-shoulder politics. And it's only really if sufficient numbers of Conservative MPs are willing to say what they really think and screw their courage to the sticking post that you will see any change. And at the moment, as I say, I don't really see many signs of that. But I think in the end, it's all down to public opinion. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing that MPs respond to public opinion, but I doubt whether, unless we see any significant shift in public opinion, that we will see much of a change on either side, if you like, of the parliamentary divide. And then you have that catch-22, which I referred to before, which is public opinion going to shift if there is no party in Parliament willing to lead public opinion? It's a difficult one.
Thank you very much. Helen? I would have actually to add a question as well regarding the suggestion that there might be actually referendums. You were mentioning, Jonathan, in the future in EU member states. Is that something you're looking at as well in your project on the 28 plus, the role of Parliament and different ways member states could react to the end of the negotiations?
Just to take that first, for now the project is focused on those countries where mainly founder member states that are holding elections in the period of the negotiations, and where there has been fairly serious pressure from populist radical parties, in particular on the right. And it's true that we're looking at electoral contests and therefore at parties. But who knows? I mean, the project's got quite a lot of sort of flex in it, so it could be that we'll let the empirics determine some of our field work. I mean, a lot's been said. I suppose I'd just sort of put what was said on the prospect of a reversal and so on in slightly different terms. I do think that to hold a second, I think my own thinking has evolved as well over, let alone feelings, but over time, which is, I do think that a second referendum wouldn't help at all if you're interested in reversing Brexit. I think a second referendum held in a political culture which hasn't really changed over that time is likely to deliver a very similar result. And I mean, if I could sort of spin what you said, I think we're talking about a failure of leadership, or it's been hard for parties and party leaders to exercise leadership, political leadership. So how would things be different if there's no political leadership to take things in a different direction? Given that public opinion, I mean, I wrote down things like there's wishful thinking, there's willful ignorance, there's, I mean, you talked about the ECJ, I mean, the headlines about the enemies of the people, about our own judges, let alone judges who are foreign. I find it hard to imagine that any of that sort of cultural referencing and so on and discourse around Britain and Europe is going to evolve. It's not going to grow up, if that's how you see it, in the immediate future. So I don't, for those reasons, I wouldn't advise a second referendum to those who would like Brexit to be reversed.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take a last round of questions, and I will take 3 more questions. So here, over there for the questions, please. Thank you. And if you can introduce yourself again. Yeah. I think. Yeah.
Amit Nagpal. Just a question and a comment, really. I always say to people in relation to the Brexit negotiations that essentially there's going to be a lot of drama over the next year and a half about this. A lot of times when it looks like it's all falling apart and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, in all these negotiations, an agreement will be reached. It'll be reached 2 or 3 days after it should be. It'll be done at 5 in the morning. And, at that point, the final offers will be made. There's no point people making their final offers, a year before, like on 20 billion or 40 billion, because otherwise the other side will just ask for more over the next 12 months. So my feeling is it will be done, but to take the title of the talk, perhaps we could get an insider view. Am I being naive? Or, are there examples of cases where deals have fallen apart and an agreement hasn't been reached at the last minute?
That's a good question. There was one question here and over there. Here, at the front. Okay, go ahead.
My name's Stephanie Clark, just an ordinary member of the public. I'm trying, I've heard discussion around, concerns around the application of trade agreements, including the CETA one that's going through national parliaments at the moment, about whether that would make it impossible. This is a question about sort of Labour Party thinking and considerations, whether it would make it impossible to implement policies of renationalisation and reversing privatisations.
Thank you very
So
much.
any comments on that, help me understand, would be appreciated.
Thank you. So 2 last over there, and then at the front will be the last intervention. Thank you.
Hello, David McSweeney, just a member of the public. Just a quick comment and a question, I suppose. As an Irish citizen living in London and somebody who observed the whole referendum here, interesting that Sir Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of his talk about the Irish border, but very little in the rest of this evening's discussion about it. And it is the one pinch point, really. A lot of the discussion this evening is about money, trade, Singapore, etc., but there seems to be nothing this evening about the Irish border, which in a sense reflects, I think, the general discourse. It's just non-existent, and I think will be, something that comes down to the gentleman mentioned about a deal being done at 5 o'clock in the morning. A deal may well be done at 5 in the morning about trade and rules, etc., but that border isn't going away. That border is open, and again, in terms of trade, etc., my question, where I'm going with this is, the issues on the border are much deeper than trade. They're fundamental about identity, and whether that border is going to be open or closed. And guys who we all know about and worry about are not interested in trade, and they're not interested in numbers, and not interested in percentages. And my question is to the people in the front of the room: what do you see, or where do you see that going, or how is that going to be addressed or resolved?
Thank you. At the front, and
Thank you. Tom McFarlane. I work in medical technology and medicines regulation on a pan-European scale, where actually the multi-language problem, we have a sort of teleological approach to it, which I'd understood the WTO and International Court of Human Rights, etc., took that approach as well, but perhaps the ECJ is a little different. My question, just following up the last two questions I've asked, relates around how the negotiation is being conducted. I mean, what strikes me is that the way this is different to almost any other trade negotiation you can think of is it's being done in public. Now, when the TTIP was being negotiated, that contained things which many citizens across Europe would regard as extremely unpalatable. In the UK, things relating to the NHS and access to data and financial regulation, etc., which I understand, Sir Jonathan, you may have been involved with some of those negotiations. So do you not feel that, in many ways, this negotiation is, whether or not it comes down to a last-minute deal, what's happening at the moment is almost a circus, and it's something where you're never going to reach appropriate deals because the main commentators are being held to account on a daily basis on the news, despite the fact that they said we're not going to offer a running commentary on this. They are doing. And in that context, how can a trade deal be negotiated?
sure. Well, thank you very much. Shall we start again, maybe with the reverse order of the panel? Helen?
Yeah, I mean, those are all really, I mean, basically I'm starting to, I'm trying to think about what you said rather than just respond off the cuff, because I think they've all given us a lot of food for thought. It's interesting, isn't it, that you talk about the negotiations and we talk about them as trade deals, but I suppose what that makes me think is that what's happening with the UK's intention to withdraw is that it's not just about trade, it's unprecedented, so a member state has never left before, and it's about unravelling member stateness or member statehood, and member statehood is not just about trade. I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but I think it's part of it's the context to the last intervention in particular, that's one of the reasons why it's not like other trade deals, because it's about withdrawing from, whether you want to call it a club or a family or a community or a union, and therefore it can't be conducted in the same way. So I don't really have an answer, I'm afraid. But it just seems to me that that's something that's been striking me recently. That it's all about. Of course, it's about a trade deal, but what about member statehood in general? And that dictates, I think, the way in which the negotiations have to occur. So it's pretty difficult. Perhaps I could pass over now.
On your question about whether trade agreements would affect the ability of a putative Labour government to renationalise or take into public ownership again various private concerns, I mean, I think we can only point to the fact that precedent suggests not. Actually, there's been no problem, I think, when states have chosen to do that within the European Union, and I honestly don't think that we would get into a situation where governments were dictated to in the same way, when we're gone. So I doubt it. I mean, but who knows? I mean, because it's perfectly possible that, of course, the agreements will be negotiated in such a way that it would be a problem, or that they'll be sort of justiciable, and therefore firms who fear that they've been their assets have been taken unfairly, could take governments to court. So it's impossible to know, but I doubt it. But I can understand why people on the left worry about that, but I doubt it. In terms of the Irish border, I'm not Irish myself, but I spend some time in Ireland. I go to Ireland quite frequently. And I have never got an answer to this. It was not raised as it should have been, or at least as much as it should have been during the campaign. Theresa Villiers, who was then the Northern Ireland Secretary, it seemed to me, was totally disingenuous about how easy it would be. The idea that this can all be sorted out by technology is equally disingenuous. People in Ireland, as you well know, are really beginning to worry about this. There have been some suggestions from Irish politicians in the Republic that perhaps the Northern Ireland could be some kind of special economic zone, taking that model into account and somehow applying it here. I actually asked a minister about this last week, and it wasn't even a proposal that he'd heard of, even though people in Dublin were talking about it all the time. So I don't suppose there is a great deal of dialogue and conversation about that particular option now, unless it's being done in secret. So I don't get how you square that circle. If anyone else does, answers on a postcard or tell us here, because I'd love to know.
Jonathan, you have the last.
All right. Well, I'll try and deal with the questions which haven't been answered. Will it go down to the wire? The first question, I think it was. And are there precedents of negotiations of this sort that have failed? Well, of this sort, no, because we've never done this before. But sure, there are lots of negotiations that have failed. We don't have TTIP with the United States. That was partly because Mr. Trump was elected, but also because public opinion was very hostile to it in many member states. There was once going to be a European defence community long before we joined. It didn't happen. We were about to join the European community twice. Everybody agreed except the French, and we didn't. So yes, talks fail, sometimes at the very last minute. Will this go down to the wire? Well, it depends when the wire is. And Mr. Davis got into this issue in the House of Commons Select Committee the other day. The wire has to be sometime before the finish line, someplace before the finish line, because you need to have parliamentary approvals of the agreement. And if it's 2359 on the 29th of March 2019, you can't expect parliaments on either side to do their stuff. There will have to be agreement on a shorter deadline at some stage, leaving time for the democratic processing of whatever's been agreed afterwards. And by processing, I don't mean necessarily that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. Parliaments are free to decide whatever they like. Yes, privatization. Okay, this is important. There are two things. One is people say on the left that the EU itself would prevent the renationalisation of, the railways, Royal Mail, water companies and so on. And another angle is agreements with foreign countries would do that. The answer is no in both cases. They wouldn't prevent it, but they would require compensation to be paid to the shareholders whose shares were being expropriated. But that is a matter of international law. In any event, even if the EU didn't exist and these particular agreements didn't exist, would be the case. There'd be an argument about how much they should be compensated by, what is the true value of the shares and so on. But, so expropriation, no. Renationalisation, yes. There are one or two issues which would have to be faced. For example, in EU if we're talking about the EU now, in EU railway law, for example, the company owning the rail operating trains and the company owning the track and the stations they have to be separate companies, not necessarily separate owners. And there are many countries in Europe where it is the state essentially doing both. So if that's what a Labour government wanted to do, it could do it. Likewise for the Royal Mail and so on. Whether it's right or wrong, and nothing to do with the EU, if that's the choice of the British Parliament, then EU law would not prevent it, and nor would any agreement. The agreement which would protect investors, say, would obviously give right to a claim for compensation on the part of an investor whose investment had been taken away from him because a government had nationalised. I don't want to leave the issue of the Irish border in the air. On the European side, but I think on the British side as well, it is considered to be an absolutely crucial, essential threshold issue which needs to be solved before anything else can be done. And it is agreed on all sides. I agree entirely that during the referendum campaign it was dealt with in a rather sort of dismissive way. It'll be all right, technology will look after it, because it was raised all the time. I had endless Irish delegation. I even had the bishops of Ireland come to see me at some stage to talk about it. The Irish realised it, the Northern Irish realised it, and the British realised it, and the 26 sort of caught up with it. And they remembered enough about what went wrong at that border to want to be sure that we got it right, kept it open, kept people and things moving across it, kept keeping Irish exports into the rest of Europe, many of which pass through Great Britain, open. It's not easy to do, and technology will help, but everybody agrees it must be done. There is no going back to what would normally be the case at an external border, checking every lorry, checking every person, phytosanitary, sanitary, everything. We don't want that to be the case in Ireland. It is, just as the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, were considered at the very beginning of the EEC to be a sort of specially further integrated bit within the wider EEC. Everybody accepts that the relations between the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland on the one hand and Ireland on the other, are of enormous historical importance. And one of the great achievements of recent years has been the peaceful resolution of the Irish troubles. So everybody's fully committed to that. Michel Barnier, as it happens, was Regional Affairs Commissioner, visited Northern Ireland a lot, is deeply committed to it. It has to be solved. It is not easy to see how it can be, but everybody agrees that it must be. The two governments are talking. I mean, the irony, of course, of the current situation is the British government, because of the election, ends up in a situation in which there is no government in Northern Ireland. The government in Westminster needs the support of one of the parties of Northern Ireland to function. I mean, if you wrote it in a novel, people wouldn't believe it, but that's where we are. So it is absolutely essential. Finally, on your question, is it difficult to negotiate in public? Of course it is, but, and we often get the balance wrong between the need for some confidential discussions between negotiators and shining the light of democracy onto it. This is one which might have been easier in the 18th century, but today is in the glare of publicity with social media and governments everywhere commenting on everything that's going on. In fact, the discipline, at least on the EU side so far, has been pretty good, but as I said earlier, that's because perhaps this is the easy bit. On the British side, it's complicated because there are clearly differences between some of the key protagonists about exactly what sort of Brexit we want, because after all, the referendum answered one simple question. Yes, we want to leave, but it didn't say how and what we wanted to replace it. So that has to be imagined.
Well, I think, no, we have to continue the discussion over drinks. I'm really sorry about that. But I'm really thankful to all of you for coming, for your participation, questions. I would like to thank the student ambassadors and also the team that has helped us having this event, so Manisha, David, and Tameda. Of course, I would like to thank the panelists, Helen, Tim, and our keynote speaker, Jonathan. And I think one of the positive outcomes of the Brexit is that it raises a lot of interest from our students who are eager to study politics, and I assume law as well. So please enjoy the drinks and join me in thanking the panelists.